Professor Bryant's final years at Columbia felt like a well-oiled but long-jammed mechanism. His life had settled into the same routines, the same gestures, even the same thoughts. Mornings began with coffee from the same blue mug, a gift from students about a decade ago. He drank it standing by the window, watching as young professors hurried down the street with folders tucked under their arms, while sleepy students dragged themselves along, faces buried in their phones. Then came the shower, the careful selection of a shirt, all the same cut, just different colors, and the bag check, glasses, lecture notes, blood pressure meds. He left the house at exactly 7:45 to catch the bus, which was always 3 minutes late. The college campus had become something like a stage set over the past 30 years, no longer bringing him joy, but not irritating him either. He knew every crack on the steps of the main building, every squeaky chair in Lecture Hall 302, where he taught his Civil War history classes. The students changed, but their faces blurred into one, always tired, distracted, occasionally interested. He'd long stopped bothering to remember names, calling them simply Mr. or Miss, and they in turn would nod politely, address him as Dr. Bryant, and forget him the moment they stepped out of the room. After lectures came the faculty lounge, where the same old-timers like him gathered. They talked about university news, retirement plans, sometimes politics, but without much passion. The conversations were like their coffee, lukewarm and bland. Richard usually stayed quiet, smoking his pipe, a habit he'd never kicked after his wife's death, and thinking about how he'd been stuck in this loop for 5 years now, with nothing changing. He'd get home by 6. The apartment in the old brick building near campus had once felt cozy, but now it was more like a museum. The same books on the shelves, the same photos on the walls. Even the dust in the corners settled in an even layer, as if preserved for atmosphere. He'd microwave dinner, usually something frozen, though he used to enjoy cooking, sit in front of the TV, turn on some History Channel, and not really watch. He'd just sit there, sometimes dozing off in his armchair while the narrator droned on about Napoleon or Washington. Weekends brought the occasional call from his kids. His son in Chicago asked about his health. His daughter in Denver updated him on the grandkids. The conversations were short, as if they all knew there wasn't much to say. Sometimes he'd go fishing, alone, at the same lake half an hour from town. It used to bring him joy, but now he'd just sit with his rod, staring at the water, thinking even the fish had stopped biting. The pharmacy near his house became something like a social club. The pharmacist, Mrs. Clark, knew him by name and always asked how he was doing. He'd say, "Fine." She'd nod, hand him his blood pressure pills, sometimes recommend something for his back pain. Once she gently suggested he check out a seniors meetup at the local library. He politely declined, but for a week afterward, he felt like some pitied old man. The most memorable event of the past few years had been the death of a colleague, Professor Edwards from the math department. They hadn't been close, but when Richard attended the funeral and saw how quickly the university moved on from someone who'd worked there for 40 years, something twisted inside him. At the reception in the faculty dining hall, everyone talked about pensions and new curricula, while Edward's photo on the table just felt like another piece of decor. That night, Richard came home, sank into his armchair, and suddenly realized his life had become one long wait. Waiting for weekends that were no different from weekdays. Waiting for calls from his kids, which came less and less often. Waiting for what? He walked to the bookshelf, pulled out an old Missouri travel guide he'd bought back in the 90s, and flipped through it. The pages on Saint Genevieve were the most worn. He'd always dreamed of visiting, especially after reading about some forgotten town archives that might hold letters from early settlers. And then it hit him. Why not move? Not just visit for a weekend, but start over. For the first time in years, he felt something like excitement. He opened his laptop, started searching for houses in that little town, imagining walking its old streets, sitting in a cafe where people might actually remember him. Then he closed it, remembering he had an 8 a.m. lecture tomorrow, and the bus would, as always, be 3 minutes late. But the idea had taken root. Over the next few weeks, he began noticing just how much Columbia had worn on him, how the noisy students under his window grated on his nerves, how sick he was of the same route every day, how empty the apartment felt, where even the kitchen clock ticked louder than ever. One morning, coffee in hand by the window, it hit him with perfect clarity. If not now, then never. A month later, Richard filed for early retirement. His colleagues were surprised. The dean tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't budge. On his last day, he walked off campus, glanced back at the familiar buildings, and felt not sadness, but relief. At home, a suitcase waited. Half his books were already packed, and on the table lay a printed lease for a small house in Sainte Genevieve. He picked up the blue mug, drank his last coffee in that apartment, and thought that maybe in a new place, the rain really would feel romantic. The death of Professor Edwards was the final nudge that sent Richard spiraling, like a loose ball bearing rattling out of an old bicycle wheel. At the funeral, he stood in the drizzling rain, listening to the dean deliver the standard spiel about a tremendous loss to the academic community, and caught himself thinking that in a month, no one would even remember the man's name. After the reception in the faculty lounge, where colleagues spent more time grumbling about upcoming budget cuts than reminiscing about the deceased, Richard wandered into Edward's now empty office. The room already smelled unfamiliar. The custodian had wiped away the dust, and stacks of papers were neatly boxed up for the archives. Only the nameplate remained on the desk, apparently forgotten. He picked it up, running his finger over the engraved letters. Professor Michael Edwards, Department of Mathematics, 1979 to 2019, 40 years reduced to 4 digits. At home, he sat in his armchair for a long time, staring at the wall where his own Distinguished Service in Education award hung. The glossy frame, the college crest, the signature of the president, who'd retired 3 years ago. He took it down, wiped the dust off the back, and suddenly realized it was just a piece of cardboard. No real value, no lasting memory. The next morning, he walked into his lecture hall as usual, but instead of pulling out his notes, he reached into his briefcase for a Missouri travel guide. Students exchanged puzzled glances when he abruptly veered off topic, swapping Civil War facts for stories about French colonists who founded Sainte Genevieve in the mid-1700s. He described brick houses with wrought iron balconies, the state's oldest winery, how time seemed to slow there. Near the end of class, one student timidly asked if this would be on the test. Richard looked at him and laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. That evening, he stopped by the pharmacy for his blood pressure pills. Mrs. Clark, as always, asked how he was doing. Instead of his usual fine, the words tumbled out, "You know, I think I'm leaving." The pharmacist nearly dropped a jar of vitamins in shock. She peppered him with questions. Where? Why? But he just smiled and said he wanted to go before they took his nameplate off the office door. News of his early retirement spread across campus like wildfire. The dean summoned him for a serious discussion in his corner office overlooking the quad. He droned on about irreplaceable faculty and staff shortages, even hinting at a possible raise. Richard nodded along, but his mind wandered to the office carpet. unchanged since the 90s, the same pattern he'd seen during his job interview decades ago. On his last day, he stayed late to clean out his office. 30 years worth of lecture notes, old student papers, memos from colleagues. Most went into the trash, but a few things made it into a box. A photo with his wife at a graduation ceremony, a dog-eared copy of Mark Twain she'd given him for his birthday, a silly card from his kids labeled "World's Best Professor Dad." As he turned off the lights and closed the door, he nearly collided with the junior professor who'd inherit the space. The man offered a nervous smile, muttering something about honor and legacy. Richard nodded politely, but he knew the truth. Within a week, the walls would be repainted, the shelves rearranged, and even the lingering scent of pipe tobacco in the curtains would vanish. At home, the great purge began. He opened closets and realized half the items were dead weight, conference suits he hadn't worn in 5 years. Mugs from students emblazoned with #1 history professor. Even books. Turns out he'd bought many out of habit, not desire. His wife's belongings were the hardest. Her scarves still carried traces of her favorite perfume, the old sewing machine she'd used to hem his pants. Sitting on the floor amid boxes, he suddenly found himself holding her battered, annotated cookbook. That's when he decided his new house would have a bigger kitchen. The kids reacted differently. His son in Chicago asked if retirement wasn't a bit premature and urged him to think it through. His Denver-dwelling daughter burst into tears over the phone, saying she admired his courage. Both offered to help him move, but he declined. This was his journey, his choice. In his final week in Columbia, he embarked on a farewell tour. He visited the diner where waitress Doris had served him the same order, cheeseburger, black coffee, for 30 years. Stopped by the library where he'd written his dissertation. Even drove out to the lake where he and his wife used to fish for perch. The fish, as usual, weren't biting, but for once it didn't bother him. On moving day, he woke early, brewed coffee in that faded blue mug, and realized he felt no fear or regret. Just a quiet thrill, like before an exam in his youth. As the movers carried out the last box, he scanned the empty apartment, his home for 20 years, and spotted a lone nickel on the windowsill, wedged beneath the curtain. He left it for the next tenant, for luck. Before driving off, he stopped by the pharmacy to say goodbye to Mrs. Clark. She surprised him by crying, thrusting a bag of pills for the road into his hands, and promising to pray for him. He almost joked that Saint Genevieve probably had pharmacies too, but the lump in his throat stopped him. He just said thank you. As he merged onto Highway 63, leaving Columbia behind, Dylan's "The Times They Are A-Changin'" crackled over the radio. Richard turned up the volume, smiling. For the first time in decades, the lyrics didn't feel like just words. The drive to Saint Genevieve should have taken 2.5 hours, but Richard stretched it to 4, stopping at every roadside diner, poking into antique shops, even detouring to an abandoned gas station because its retro sign struck him as photogenic. In the trunk lay his daughter's gift, a camera he hadn't touched in years. Now he snapped everything: rusty fuel pumps, scraggly oaks by the road, even his own reflection in the rearview mirror. Wrinkles, gray hair, but the eyes? Same as in his college photos, back when he hitchhiked across Europe. The first thing he noticed entering town was the sign, Saint Genevieve Estienne, 1735. The numbers curled in ornate script as if urging him to slow down. He did, dropping to 20 miles per hour despite the empty streets. Back in Columbia, drivers would have honked by now. The house he'd rented from photos turned out better than advertised. Brick with an ironwork balcony in a postage stamp garden where the first spring tulips poked through. The landlady, Mrs. Landry, greeted him on the porch holding a pie. 70 if a day, in a gingham apron and gray curls escaping her kerchief. She launched into the house's history before he'd set foot inside. Built by her great-grandfather in the 1850s, original balcony, kitchen redone in the 60s but respectfully. Richard nodded, pretending to absorb the flood of details while studying the doorknobs. Antique brass with floral engravings. Exactly the kind of quirks he'd hoped for. The key she handed him belonged in a museum, heavy with intricate scrollwork. The lock was original too, she explained, so it required finesse. Turn left twice, then jiggle gently. Richard tried, failed. Mrs. Landry laughed, took the key, and opened the door in one smooth motion. Inside smelled of beeswax and something else. Lavender, old books. The floors creaked underfoot so musically, the house seemed to speak. In the living room, she showed him a cabinet with a rose-carved door. Behind it lay a hidden drawer. Surprise, she said, left by the last tenant. Empty, except for a single worn nickel. Richard chuckled. Fate, I guess. She left, promising to return tomorrow with the pie recipe, and he stood alone among boxes. First, he unpacked his late wife's cookbook onto the kitchen shelf. Then he hung photos, just the important ones. The rest could wait. That evening, he explored town. Empty streets, save for laughter and the smell of fried onions drifting from Modine Cafe. Stepping inside felt oddly vulnerable. Back in Colombia, he knew every diner. Here, he was a stranger. The bartender, a burly man with an anchor tattoo, nodded. New in town? Richard admitted he'd moved in today. First craft ciders on the house, then, the man said, pouring it into a tall glass. Over drinks, the bartender, Joe, revealed he descended from early settlers and dished out advice. Where to buy bread, which market day had the freshest produce, and never argue with Mrs. Thibodeau about her mushroom gratin recipe unless you enjoy public humiliation. Richard took notes on his phone, then asked where to find good reading. Joe paused. Libraries on Main Street, but for stories? Hit the museum archives. Old Lucas there could talk your ear off. Walking back, Richard got lost. The streets coiled illogically. Dim streetlights forced him to squint at signs. Just as worry set in, he spotted a glow in Antique Treasure's window. Long after closing, the door was ajar. He knocked, peering inside. A thin woman in thick glasses was restoring a porcelain doll. She set it down. You're not a robber, I hope. Richard assured her he was just lost. She introduced herself as Edith, the owner, and grilled him on his background. Hearing he was a historian, she brightened. Oh, you must come to our Heritage Craft Fair Saturday. Her hand-drawn map on scrap paper nearly made him laugh. Not just turns, but notes like house with the infamous cat, bench that squeaks, avoid, and tree where a bride vanished in 1923. Back home, a basket waited on his porch. Muffins, homemade jam, and a note. Welcome to the neighborhood. Maggie, third house down. Sitting on the steps, Richard broke off a still-warm muffin. In Colombia, neighbors didn't know each other's names. That night, he wrestled with the bed, the mattress too soft after his old one. Tossing, he noticed a ceiling crack shaped like Missouri's outline. Wind howled outside. A shutter banged. In Colombia, he'd hated nighttime noise. Car engines, drunken students. Here the sounds belonged to the town itself, his new old home. He fell asleep thinking tomorrow's first stop would be that archive. Something told him those dusty shelves held what he'd spent his life searching for. Traces of Saint Genevieve's earliest days, maybe even letters from the people who built it. The first few weeks in Saint Genevieve passed in a strange rhythm, sometimes too fast, sometimes painfully slow. Richard wavered between feeling like a tourist who'd be leaving any day and suddenly realizing this was now his home. He grew accustomed to the creaky floorboards, mastered the finicky front door lock on the first try, and even discovered that the hidden compartment in the closet was perfect for stashing a bottle of bourbon. Mornings began with coffee from an old enameled Turkish pot. He'd bought it at Antique Treasures from Edith, who promptly supplied him with care instructions and a stern warning never to wash it with soap. The coffee came out strong, with grounds at the bottom, just like during his college backpacking trips through Turkey. Richard drank it on the little balcony, watching the town wake up. At exactly 7:30, Mailman Bill would walk by, always in a cowboy hat, even though St. Genevieve hadn't seen real cowboys since the Louisiana Purchase. At 7:45, Mrs. Landry stepped out to water her geraniums, and by 8 o'clock, the teenage girl from across the street would sprint out, pink headphones on, perpetually late for the school bus. The library on Main Street became a second home. A small brick building with stained glass windows and wooden shelves stretching to the ceiling. The librarian, Miss Clara, a woman with a silver bun and a perpetual knitted shawl, quickly memorized his tastes, setting aside new history arrivals and even letting him use the staff entrance when the main doors were still locked. It was there, in the corner by the window, that he started his local history blog. The first posts were a struggle. Writing for a general audience wasn't the same as lecturing to students. He drowned in details, overloaded the text with dates, then cursed himself while deleting entire paragraphs. But gradually he found his voice, light tinged with irony, like telling a story over a mug of cider at Modine's bar. Modine's became his third sanctuary. Joe, the bartender with an anchor tattoo, now greeted him with a nod and wordlessly slid over a craft cider. The regulars were a motley crew: farmers, vineyard owners, a couple of artists, even the local priest, who preferred whiskey to his prayer book on Fridays. Richard sat there jotting notes, slowly easing into conversations. One evening, Joe asked if he'd consider giving a little talk on the town's history for the patrons. Folks here love hearing about themselves, but nobody knows how to package it right, the bartender explained. Richard agreed, though his stomach twisted with nerves. Back at the college, he'd known every crack in the lecture hall ceiling, every sigh from his students. Here he'd be speaking to people who might know St. Genevieve's history better than he did. The lecture took place on the last Friday of the month. Richard prepared like it was his dissertation defense. Notes, maps, even bringing a few old coins from his collection. The cafe was packed. He opened with a joke about getting lost in town his first week, and the tension melted. Talking about the French settlers, he suddenly noticed Mrs. Landry in the back, nodding and scribbling in a notepad. When local legends came up, an older man at the bar added a detail Richard hadn't known, about the ghost of a monk still said to wander the vineyards. It turned into a collective storytelling session, one person adding to another's tale, debating, laughing. Richard just steered the conversation, feeling less like a lecturer and more like part of something alive. At the end, Joe announced these nights would now be regular, and everyone clapped. But not everything was smooth sailing. One day, Richard stopped by the local bakery where Mrs. Thibodeau was famous for her croissants. He complimented them but added that in France they were made with slightly fewer layers. The bakery went quiet. Mrs. Thibodeau, a bulldog-faced woman with dough-kneading hands, slowly set down her spatula. "Professor," she said with icy politeness, "my great-grandmother was baking these croissants back when your Missouri was still French territory." Richard realized he'd stepped on the exact rake Joe had warned him about. He apologized hastily, bought 2 croissants, and retreated to the laughter of other customers. At home, another neighborly surprise awaited. a basket with a bottle of homemade wine, and a note, "Don't worry, Mrs. Thibodeau greets everyone like that. Maggie." The wine was dry with a faint oakiness. Richard sipped it from a cut glass tumbler on the balcony, thinking how strange life was. Back in Colombia, he could go weeks speaking to no one but the supermarket cashier. Here, every day brought new faces, small clashes, and unexpected kindnesses. One morning, he realized he'd forgotten to buy milk. In Colombia, that meant a trip to a 24-hour store. Here, he just knocked on Mrs. Landry's door. Not only did she give him milk, but she sat him down with fresh cinnamon rolls. Over tea, she mentioned her late husband had also loved history, then offered, "I've got old papers gathering dust in the attic. Might those interest you?" The attic was a gold mine. Letters, receipts, even a diary from one of Mrs. Landry's ancestors, chronicling daily life in the 1870s. Richard spent the whole day there, forgetting lunch, and brought her a bottle of wine that evening in thanks. But there were hard moments too. On rainy evenings, loneliness hit harder. He'd turn on the TV, but the chatter only emphasized the silence. Once he caught himself narrating a football game aloud, as if his wife were still in the armchair across from him. Then he'd grab an umbrella and head to Modine's. Joe seemed to understand, setting a cider in front of him and turning the blues down low. Sometimes a regular would join, and the conversation would drift to easier topics. Slowly, the town unfolded for him like an old book with gilded edges. He learned that Wednesdays meant chess at Antique Treasures, and Saturday mornings brought farmers to the square with not just produce but fresh baked bread, the kind he'd only dreamed of in Colombia. One day, passing the museum, he spotted a notice. Volunteer needed for archive work. Special interest, 18th century documents. His heart raced. This was it, the forgotten letters of early settlers he'd read about. Inside, he met old Lucas, the man Joe had mentioned, 80 of a day, in a plaid shirt with an unlit pipe clenched between his teeth. Lucas was a walking encyclopedia and, more importantly, a master storyteller. In 3 hours, Richard learned more about Saint Genevieve than weeks of reading. When he mentioned his blog, Lucas brightened. "Oh, so you're the professor. Mrs. Thibodeau's already talked about you." Richard tensed, but the old man laughed. "Don't fret. She tests everyone that way. Come back next week. I'll show you something special." On his way out, Lucas tucked an old photograph into his pocket, a view of the town square circa 1900. "For inspiration," he said. Walking home, Richard took a wrong turn and ended up by the river. The water flowed lazily, reflecting the sunset. He sat on the ledge, comparing the photo to the present. Same buildings, just taller trees. His phone buzzed, his daughter calling. "So how's your little old town?" she asked. Richard looked around. A factory smokestack puffed across the river. A fishing boat glided by, and church bells rang faintly in the distance. "You know," he said, "it's not that old. Just alive." She laughed, called him a romantic, and promised to visit next month. Tucking his phone away, Richard breathed in the damp earth and something else. Maybe baking bread, maybe just spring. Tomorrow he'd return to the archives. Lucas had something to show him. He'd also returned Mrs. Landry's teacup, accidentally taken from the attic, and maybe stop by the bakery, this time praising the croissants without any French comparisons. Walking home, the creak of the floorboards underfoot sounded almost familiar. The City Museum's archives turned out to be exactly as Richard had imagined. Dusty, slightly chaotic, and smelling of old books. Lucas, true to his word, was waiting for him at a wooden table with pull-out drawers, topped by a green-shaded lamp that had clearly seen decades of use. "Here you go, Professor." Lucas handed him a shoebox crammed with papers. Found this the other day while sorting. Documents from the 1780s, I think. Pretty sure no one's laid eyes on them since my great-granddad's time. Richard felt his breath catch as he carefully lifted the lid. Inside was exactly what he'd been hoping for. A stack of yellowed 18th century letters tied with a disintegrating ribbon, a few faded invoices, and most importantly, a leather-bound diary. The ribbon crumbled at his touch, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. Easy now, Lucas hissed, as if Richard were holding a newborn, not a pile of old papers. These aren't your students' scribbled notes. The first sheet Richard pulled from the stack was a letter written in elegant but hurried script. He squinted, struggling to decipher the words. 18th century French wasn't quite what he'd studied in college. Mon cher ami, he began aloud, but Lucas cut him off. Translate, Professor. Last time I heard French was when my cat stepped on the neighbor's dog's tail. Richard smiled and continued, picking his words slowly. The letter was addressed to a certain Claude Lefebvre from his cousin in New Orleans. The writer complained about rising prices, mentioned some shipments for the fort, and then, almost as an afterthought, wrote about a new settlement by the river where the land is fertile, but the Indians are restless. This is about Saint Genevieve. Richard looked up at Lucas. This is the earliest mention I've ever seen. Lucas snorted, pulled a pair of wire-rimmed glasses from his pocket, and perched them on the tip of his nose. Well, if the professor's impressed, maybe it is worth something. They spent the whole day with the documents. Lucas kept ducking out for tea or to make sure tourists weren't pocketing exhibits, while Richard lost himself in the past. The letters painted a picture of the settlers' daily lives, land disputes, marriages between Frenchmen and local women, and how a man named Dubois had gambled away half his tobacco harvest. But the real treasure was the diary. It belonged to one Antoine Martel, a fur trader who chronicled the town's earliest years. On one page, Richard found an entry that made his pulse quicken. This morning, young Bertrand's body was found by the river. They say he quarreled with Dubois over a debt, but I saw them drinking together at Leroux's last night. Richard set the diary aside. This wasn't just a historical record. It was a human drama playing out on these very streets 2.5 centuries ago. As the museum was closing, Lucas groaned to his feet. Take it, Professor, he said, waving at the box. Just bring it back in one piece, and write something interesting for your blog, will you? Mrs. Thibodeau says you only ever write about architecture. Where are the people? At home, Richard spread the letters across his kitchen table, pushing aside a half-eaten sandwich. He photographed each page, took notes, and then, well past midnight, began drafting a blog post. This time, the words flowed. He wasn't writing about dates and facts, but about people whose voices had suddenly come alive in those yellowed lines. He fell asleep at the table, only to be woken the next morning by his daughter's call. "Dad, you okay?" she fretted. "You've usually posted 3 times by now." Rubbing his eyes, Richard checked the screen. His late-night post had 5 times the usual traffic. The comments were buzzing, locals debating possible ties to the Bertrands and Dubois, sharing family legends that now had documentary proof. By noon, the mayor had proposed an exhibit featuring the newly discovered papers. Back at the museum, a surprise awaited him. Lucas sat at his desk, chatting with an elderly couple who gestured excitedly at the box of letters. "Ah, Professor," Lucas turned. "You've got visitors." It turned out they were the Lefebvre, distant descendants of the very Claude from the letter. They'd heard about the discovery from neighbors and rushed over at dawn. "My great-grandfather always said we had merchants in the family," Mrs. Lefebvre explained, breathless. But we thought it was just a story. Richard gave them an impromptu tour of the documents, and then Mr. Lefebvre suddenly remembered an old trunk of papers in their attic. You wouldn't, he hesitated. I mean, if you're interested. And so Richard found himself at the Lefebvre's house, sipping strong coffee while sorting through another trove of family history. By evening, neighbors had joined them. Someone brought pie, someone else wine, and an ordinary Thursday turned into an impromptu history gathering. Mrs. Thibodeau, it turned out, was related to the very Dubois who'd lost the tobacco. She grumbled about her ancestor disgracing the family name, but eventually admitted her croissants were now practically historical artifacts. That night, after the guests had left, Richard stopped by Modine's. Joe slid a cider across the counter before he could order. Well, Professor, he grinned, looks like you're not just a historian now. You're practically a detective. Richard sipped his drink, marveling at life's quirks. Back in Columbia, he lectured for years about distant events to politely indifferent students. Here, every line from the past resonated in the present, because it wasn't some abstract once upon a time, but the story of their homes, their families. Before bed, he checked his email. Buried in spam and ads was a message from the local historical society offering to lead an archive digitization project. Richard leaned back on his pillow, staring at the ceiling. In one corner was a water stain vaguely shaped like France. He'd noticed it on his first day, but never bothered to paint over. Now he figured he wouldn't. Outside, the bells of St. Genevieve's church rang. Back in Columbia, he'd have yanked the curtain shut in irritation. Here, he just smiled and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring a new morning, new letters, new faces, and that was far more exciting than any lecture at the fanciest university.